Hi, everyone who's joined so far. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to give some time for people to join, and we should start right at noon.
And I hope that if there are folks in Louisiana, that everybody is safe and dry and has power.
If you're in Louisiana and you're on a webinar, I'm impressed with you. I'll just say that. I'm very impressed. Well, my clock says it's noon, so why don't we go ahead and get started? I'd just like to welcome everyone to Still Effing Here. I appreciate you showing up. My name is Tonia Poteat. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Social Medicine at the University of North Carolina, and I'm here with Ames Simmons, who is the policy director at Equality North Carolina. This webinar is co-sponsored by the UNC, University of North Carolina Center for Health Equity Research, and the TRANSnetwork, which is a collaboratory of trans people, allies, researchers, and healthcare providers who are working together towards better health and well-being for trans people throughout the South. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Ames, who will share some information with us, and then we'll come back together for a Q&A.
Thank you, Tonia, and thanks to you and to UNC for having me and for holding this webinar. So I'm going to share out my screen so that you can see some of the stuff that we have planned. Okay, so Tonia has introduced herself and the network and UNC. My name is Ames. My pronouns are he and him, and I work as policy director at Equality North Carolina, which is a statewide LGBTQ social justice organization. And I also teach a transgender readings course at the law school at Duke. And we just had our first class this week. So this is all very timely. I want to say briefly, again, I feel for, my heart is going out to the folks who are dealing with Hurricane Laura right now in Louisiana and I guess the panhandle of Texas. And also just want to hold space for this has just been a viciously difficult week of violence against against Black people, people of color generally, with what is happening nationally, as well as, some of the hate speech that we're seeing around the RNC in Charlotte and some videos that have come out from a university here in North Carolina. So this is a difficult time. It probably feels unrelentingly difficult, and just want to hold space for that. Also, I wanted to explain the title for this presentation. When Tonia first approached me, we were thinking, because this project, Transforming the Carolinas, has wrapped up, and we wanted to disseminate that information. We were going to talk about that. And then there were a bunch of developments at the federal level in courts and in the agencies that we wanted to also give like a legal update about what's happening. And when we were trying to think of a title for the presentation, I think when we first started thinking about this was right after the Trump administration had announced that they were going to put out this terrible rule, which HUD has now done, that will allow shelters to turn away transgender women. And so the title that came to me was from, it was a quote from Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who's really one of the elders of the trans movement, of the LGBTQ movement, generally. She was part of Stonewall, and we owe a lot to her. And there's a documentary film about her that's called Major that I recommend to you. And that we may have to edit this later. The quote from Miss Major was that she said, "We are still fucking here." And I guess that is, that pretty much sums up the attitude that that I have as a trans person, and the other trans people around me have voiced. And again, I hold a lot of unearned advantage compared to a lot of folks in the trans community, since I'm white and I identify as male. So we especially wanted to acknowledge that there are some people, like, we are not all still here. And we wanted to be real and intellectually honest about that. This has been, every year we say this has been the most deadly year on record for losing transgender people to violence. And 2020 seems to be on track for that. So again, these are the people who are no longer with us because of violence directed toward the trans community. Beautiful folks. Okay. So I want to talk about transforming the Carolinas, this project that Dr. Poteat undertook as part of the ending the HIV epidemic strategy that CDC has put forward. The full name of the project was Transforming the Carolinas, Ending the HIV Epidemic for Transgender People of Color in North Carolina and South Carolina. So Tonia first approached me almost exactly a year ago about part of the project would look at the legal and policy barriers that exist in North and South Carolina that make it difficult for us to end the epidemic of HIV for trans people of color in our two states. And because I had this teaching appointment at Duke, we had a law student who did all the background research for the policy report. And I'm just really proud that this was a UNC Duke joint, because, you know, you just don't often see the two blues that are right down the street from each other cooperating and putting out a cool report. So the research was done by Krista Kowalczyk and was sort of shaped, I guess, and directed by Professor Allison Rice at the law school at Duke and me. And the full report is up on Equality NC's website, and we'll have a resource at the end that will have links so you can easily get to the full report. I'm not going to go through the full report. It is very, very detailed, but I'm going to try to hit the highlights for you and then give a brief legal update. So who are trans people of color in North Carolina and South Carolina? So I just want to point out, like, I'm getting ready to say a bunch of things that have a bunch of data points on them. And there are lots of people who are data nerds and think things are more believable and meaningful when there are numbers attached to them. So y'all will all be super happy with the next couple of slides that have statistics on them. But it is kind of dry, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. I do want to especially give respect and props to Holiday Simmons at the Campaign for Southern Equality, who filmed a video highlighting the Transforming the Carolinas project on National Transgender HIV Testing Day, which is every year on April 18th. And you can see Holiday's video again on Equality NC's YouTube, and we'll have a link for you. But the policy itself is kind of hard to make it come to life without understanding some of the stories of who transgender people are. So even though this policy report doesn't have a lot of photographs. It doesn't have any photographs of transgender people of color. And it doesn't, it was not a qualitative research report. It doesn't have stories or quotes to help bring it to life. But do know that actual trans human beings of color were part of focus groups and interviews and took part in an online survey. So it's not necessarily part of what I'm going to present, but it certainly was part of the project. So one of the things that I hope to add with this policy report was an estimation of how many trans people of color there are in North Carolina and South Carolina. So the Williams Institute, which is a think tank at the UCLA School of Law, has estimated nationally that 0.6% of the population in our country identifies as transgender, which we know is underreported. It's not safe for many people to be out as trans. And North Carolina and South Carolina are both pretty close to that average. So North Carolina is 0.6 and South Carolina is 0.58%. I also looked at demographic statistics about the total number of residents in North Carolina and South Carolina. North Carolina has about twice the population that South Carolina has, but South Carolina has a slightly greater percentage of people of color. So I applied that percentage or those percentages across the population and estimated that there are, again, this is a projection, it's not based on counting human beings, that there are maybe around 14,000 trans people of color in North Carolina and around 7,000 trans people of color in South Carolina. And this is important because a lot of times when policymakers are looking at statistics, they will see this 0.6% and think like that is a negligible portion of the population. I've had people say things like this to me. And you kind of sometimes have to say like, you might think that it's less than 1% and write it off, but it's thousands of people. This will likely come as no surprise to folks who've been living this reality a long time before this report was written. We do not have any statewide protections based on gender identity in either state, in North Carolina or South Carolina. And that's really not that uncommon across the South. There are still many states that in the South that don't have statewide employment protections or housing or public accommodations. There are a few pockets. If you work for, this is a little bit of a gloss, but if you work for the state in North Carolina, and really if you work for one of the agencies that is part of Governor Cooper's cabinet, then you have employment protection through an executive order. And if you work for the cities of Charlotte or Charleston or Columbia, if you're a municipal employee, then you have protection. But if you work for a private employer, you do not have protection under state law based on your gender identity. There are federal protections, so we will hear more about that later. There are no statewide housing protections. In fact, cities can't even protect LGBTQ people or trans people in North Carolina because the legislature has taken away that right. In South Carolina, however, Charleston and Columbia do have ordinances that provide protection against discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And also when it comes to public accommodations, those are things, public places and spaces like, hotels and restaurants and movie theaters, but also importantly, hospitals and clinics. So we don't have any statewide public accommodations protections. But again, Charleston and Columbia have extended those protections at the municipal level based on gender identity. North Carolina is not able, the cities in North Carolina cannot extend those protections until after part of a law expires later this year. Then cities will be able to do that, and counties. There are also functional policy barriers that are making it difficult to ending the HIV epidemic. Neither state has expanded Medicaid, so there's a whole swath of people who are not able to get HIV treatment because they don't have health insurance, and they may make too much money to qualify for traditional Medicaid. There's very few states left. Almost all of them are in the South that have not expanded Medicaid. Also, both states have HIV criminalization laws. So these are laws that say if you do certain things while having HIV, then that is a crime. This is criminalizing your status as a person living with HIV. In North Carolina, the HIV, this is part of the administrative law that was recently modernized, so that if you are virally suppressed, like if you're undetectable and untransmittable, then you don't have to disclose that that you are living with HIV. You have to also still be in care. So you have to have been virally suppressed for 6 months and in care. But otherwise, it's still a misdemeanor to have sex with somebody and not disclose that you are living with HIV, unless you fit in one of those exceptions. Both states also, part of the HIV criminalization laws, if you share syringes with someone while living with HIV, that is a crime. And in South Carolina, if you are a person who trades sex while having HIV, that is against the law. South Carolina's law is a felony. So South Carolina's HIV criminalization is worse than North Carolina's, but there's always room for advocacy. Additionally, we are increasingly coming to understand the way that surveillance leads to criminalization, and this new frontier of molecular surveillance, where scientists are analyzing your DNA, your blood, or other ways that they can take samples and then project who all you might have come into contact with, who might need to be alerted and tested for HIV. This whole scheme of molecular surveillance is basically like the state controlling trans people without our consent, and in many cases without our knowledge. Also, state violence can also take the form of incarceration. So any things that we decide to make a crime mean that more people are going to be in our prisons, and we know that that is going to hit Black and brown people harder, and that it's also going to hit transgender people harder. So transgender people of color are even more likely to be dealing with state violence in prisons because of the HIV criminalization laws. These laws also create the risk of dating violence and intimate partner violence in the community, because if you are if you have a sexual relationship with someone, they can always threaten to call the I guess they're called the disease surveillance people, basically the public health police, and say that you didn't disclose that you had HIV. This is something they can hold over someone's head as a power and control tactic in an intimate partner violence situation. So all of these things make it more difficult for people to get into healthcare to end the HIV epidemic and to stay in healthcare. And of course, COVID-19 makes all of this worse. Across so many ways. We were just talking about criminalization, and now we know there's even more surveillance with COVID-19 because of contact tracing, which is certainly an important part of trying to stem the pandemic here, but raises some privacy concerns. the pandemic has also had a big impact on the economy. There have been lots of folks who have lost their jobs. Nationally, 26% of transgender people of color have become unemployed because of COVID-19, compared to only 12% of the general population. So more than twice as much as the general population. And then it has, obviously, COVID is a healthcare condition, so it's had a health impact nationally. And transgender people are disproportionately likely to have conditions that might make COVID more dangerous or risky. So the Williams Institute has estimated that nationally there's over 200,000 trans people who are over age 65. There are over 200,000 trans people who have asthma. I have asthma. And this is a respiratory condition that can make COVID-19 especially dangerous. And we know that trans people are disproportionately likely to be living with HIV. And if you don't have access to healthcare, then that makes it more difficult for you to get to the level of undetectable and untransmittable. We've been really careful to make sure that public health is not saying that simply having HIV is a risk factor for the pandemic. The issue is when people are immunocompromised. So when they have not yet been able to achieve viral suppression, that can make COVID-19 worse. And the federal government is in there making all of this worse. We're paying taxes for them to help solve these problems, and they're actually creating more problems. In June, so 3 or 4 months into the pandemic, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services finalized a rule that rolled back protections that the Obama administration had put in place against gender identity discrimination in healthcare and in health insurance, just when people need healthcare more than ever in the middle of a pandemic. And then not to be, that they follow that up shortly. They didn't quite get it into Pride Month, but they were definitely trying. On July 1st, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development proposed a rule that would roll back protections that the Obama administration had put in place against gender identity discrimination by emergency shelters. This is coming right at a time when families are having to isolate together, which creates a heightened risk of family violence and domestic violence, and in some cases can result in people experiencing houselessness. This is a time when people need more access to shelters and not less. But there is hope to be had. In employment, as I mentioned, there are new federal protections because of a Supreme Court decision in June that held that sex discrimination includes transgender status. This is a huge victory for the LGBTQ community, and opens up a lot of opportunities to win additional protections in federal law. It's not perfect though. It only covers employers who employ 15 or more people. So it doesn't cover really small business, and it doesn't protect independent contractors or gig workers or people who are trading drugs or sex for money. There has also been a victory in healthcare. A federal court in New York has put a hold on that rule that I was just telling you about, the healthcare rights law. So that all still has to go through the whole full court process. But this district court in New York has said, basically, if sex discrimination includes transgender status, you need to at least incorporate some analysis of that into this rule. And in fact, transgender people are likely to proceed if some of the lawsuits that have been filed against that rule go forward. Importantly, this lawsuit in New York was one that Human Rights Campaign brought on behalf of 2 transgender women of color. So some of the other plaintiffs have been organizations like Whitman Walker, LGBTQ health clinics. It's especially important here that HRC was representing two trans women of color who have been suffered tremendous discrimination at the hands of healthcare, like many people, I suspect, in North Carolina and South Carolina. There are ways that you can take action, especially on this anti-trans shelter rule. There is an opportunity for you to submit public comment to HUD until September 22nd, telling them that this is wrong and you're not okay with it. So there's still an opportunity to try to stop that shelter rule. This is very easy to do. There are some detailed instructions about how to submit a comment at housingSavesLives.org. Also really important for you to complete the census. The census questions about gender still suck. There are not enough options, and the census, it doesn't ask any questions about sexual orientation or gender identity, but it's still really important for us to complete it, because until we make sure that we get counted, that's how we build enough power to change the questions for the 2030 census. So the federal government has shortened the period to answer the census. You now only have until the end of September, but it's easy to do online. And then also what you can do to take action is you can vote. There's a presidential election in November, and there are congressional seats that are up, as well as many judicial seats and state legislature seats here in North Carolina. And we recommend that you vote early so that you're not standing in line with a lot of other people in the middle of a pandemic, and you can vote early between October 15th and October 31st. And now we are going to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Ames, for that fantastic overview. I still don't know how you hold all these moving parts in your head over time. I will encourage people who are on the call, if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to ask them on your behalf, and Ames will dive into his deep well of knowledge and be able to answer them. But in the meantime, I had some questions that I wanted to sort of put out there in a couple of different categories, some questions about voting, about employment, and about healthcare. So say, for example, there's a trans person who lost their job recently because an employer found out that they were trans, they were outed at work. Does this recent Supreme Court decision mean that the person can get their job back? You're on mute.
It very likely means that. So the thing to do if that happens is please reach out to us, and we would like to connect you to the, particularly the legal team at Transgender Legal Education and Defense Fund. So if you've been discriminated against, it would be a great idea for us to connect you to an organization who has specialized knowledge in court around these issues. But yes, despite the fact that there aren't any state level protections, I mean, the EEOC, so if you've been discriminated against, one thing to consider is if you're in a union, to go through your collective bargaining process, your union grievance process. North Carolina law is pretty hostile to unions, so there's not a lot of folks who work in a unionized workplace. You also have the ability to try to, negotiate these things directly with your employer. If you don't get satisfaction that way, what you have to do an administrative process first at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. And you do not have to have a lawyer for that, but it's not a bad idea. And then the EEOC will send a letter to your employer and do an investigation, and either they will say, yes, we want to sue on your behalf, or they will issue you a letter that says we concluded our investigation, and you can now file a lawsuit in federal court if you want. So Title VII, which is the provision of the Civil Rights Act that covers employment, we now have from the Supreme Court that it includes gender identity. So it is a much more sure thing if you've been discriminated against because you are trans at work, that you would be able to seek all the remedies that are available under Title VII. In some cases, that means getting your job back. It means back pay in some cases. There's, you know, a lot of different methods of relief under Title VII. So this is, like I said, a big win for the trans community.
That's great. We're getting some questions coming in. So speaking of wins, there's a question about whether the New York decision means that trans people will have protections in healthcare for the time being while the case is continuing through the court system.
So one thing, yes, folks will still have protection. I want to say at the outset that the fact that the Trump administration decided to roll back these regulations that President Obama put in place never meant that you didn't have the right to healthcare without discrimination. The Trump administration, sometimes they get confused and they think that they actually have the same powers that Congress and the courts have. And over again, Congress and the courts have been telling the Trump administration, like, no, you can't do that as the president. Like, we make the laws or we interpret the laws. It is a good thing that this New York court put this injunction in place the day before that law was supposed to take effect. So in theory, well, let me say this, in practicality, what that probably means is if there were healthcare providers who were in tune to all that mess going on at the federal level with HHS, and they were thinking, thank God I can now discriminate against transgender people who I've hated forever, and they're paying attention, then now they're thinking, well, I should probably wait at least a few months to start discriminating against people seeking healthcare until this court process works out. Anyone who's experiencing discrimination in healthcare, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund has an entire health project. They have a very talented attorney, Noah Lewis, who it supervises and directs that project. So definitely the legal organizations want to know about it now, if it's happening to you now.
That's fantastic. Thank you. There's a few other questions. There's a person who wants to know if there are significant differences between discrimination and disadvantage between trans men and trans women. I don't know if you have access to that information or some thoughts about that.
So here, my top line thought to answer this question is, this is why you need to complete the census. The answer is, I don't think that we know, because there is not, those data are not being collected anywhere on a systematic basis. The census isn't collecting it. Most of the federal agencies that were collecting data about sexual orientation or gender identity, the Trump administration has figured that out and stopped it. And in many cases, what data the government has collected is not separated or disaggregated between transgender men and transgender women and non-binary people. So it's real hard for us to have much of an understanding. But Tonia has done a lot of scientific research around trans people living with HIV, and in the research community is starting to report disaggregated data. I mean, we know that there are some things that are different based on the anatomy that you have presents different risks. But when I really should just let Tonia answer, but I think as far as HIV goes, that we just don't, trans men have just not, they've been understudied over time. And I don't think we have a real grasp on HIV risk for transgender men or for non-binary people.
I would agree with that. And I say the same is true around violence and other forms of discrimination, that we don't really have the data that we need. The US trans survey that happened in 2015 that included 27,000 trans and non-binary people was amazing for providing data. But what we often hear is that we don't have a way of knowing if that is truly representative of all trans people. So we can extrapolate from that. And I think what I would say is that people's experiences of discrimination are different, but I wouldn't say that that necessarily means that there's less or more in one group. And I would say triple that for non-binary people. There's just very limited data for non-binary people overall. We also got a public service announcement for Arkansas that I'd like to share. You mentioned the early voting period in North Carolina, and someone wanted to make sure that we knew that in Arkansas, the early voting period is October 19th through November 2nd. And if you've already applied for absentee ballot, uh-oh, somebody just moved the question. Okay, if you've already applied for an absentee ballot, that should arrive in your mail in late September, and send it back as soon as possible to get around mail delays. So if you're in Arkansas, important information. There's another question that said, thank you for your work, Ames. What are the top 3 areas of advocacy work that's most important for providers to engage in right now to advocate for trans and non-binary clients or patients in our settings?
One thing that you can do for the next, only for another couple days, there is a sign-on letter that is going around for healthcare providers through GLAMA, which used to be the Gay and Lesbian Medical Association, but now has a longer title that I don't remember right off the top of my head. They are collecting healthcare provider signatures opposing the trans shelter rule, and it was supposed to close on Monday, but they have extended GLAMA. So again, a nonprofit that's putting together signatures, not the actual federal government rule, has extended. You can still sign on up through Monday. And if you aren't a member of GLAMA, just email me and I can get you the link to sign on.
Okay, great, thank you.
Oh wait,
anything else?
I only gave one thing, sorry. I think it's been important for healthcare providers to be commenting about the healthcare rights law, and that may continue to be important depending on the direction that law, which is sometimes called Section 1557, what direction that takes. And then I would also say the third thing is there has also been a provider sign-on letter that was started by Dr. Colt Meyer, who is now, I think, in Minneapolis. He's gone somewhere up north from where he was in Houston, against a bunch of legislation that has popped up in state legislatures that basically restricts healthcare providers' ability to prescribe trans affirming healthcare, honestly, to provide any kind of trans affirming healthcare to minors. We have not seen that law in North Carolina. It was introduced in South Carolina, and it did not make it out of committee. None of those laws have been enacted yet that I am aware of, but honestly, what we're hearing is the only reason why more of them didn't get enacted was because the pandemic stopped many state legislatures from meeting. So there's an expectation that that we'll see those laws again. I don't know whether we'll see them in North Carolina or not, but I would guess since there was already one filed in South Carolina, it will be back. That's an especially important area for providers to be talking about to the legislature, why there's just a lot of misinformation that gets presented to them about, I'll just stop there.
Well, there's a question that follows up on that about what role can and should healthcare providers in particular play in mitigating the lack of structural protections for the health and well-being of trans people.
There's so many incredibly giving and talented healthcare providers who do things like provide sliding scale services, like volunteering at community health centers or at clinics. And if you own your own practice, and you can make it work financially, providing low cost healthcare to the trans community is really important, and doing it during hours when trans people can actually get there, like after 5 p.m. and on weekends, which are times when you want to relax like everyone else. But trans people can't get healthcare in the meantime. So there have been a lot of providers who really have been stepping into the breach of trying to provide healthcare. There are also some telehealth options that are available right now. And I'm thinking especially of Queer Med, which is an online service that Dr. Izzy Lowell from Atlanta started. She's just an amazing person. She's very trans competent, and there are lots of trans folks who she sees through telehealth to get hormones. And I don't know, right now during COVID, telehealth is the way to go. We've talked on a previous webinar in the TRANSnetwork about how important telehealth has been to making sure that trans people continue to have access to healthcare. But in many places, some of the telehealth options are going to go away when the state of emergency goes away. And there's just no reason for that. Like, if we're able to do it right now during a pandemic, we should be able to do it after a pandemic. So I think to the extent that you have an opportunity to weigh in with Medicaid or with any private health insurers about the importance of telehealth, I think that is a way that we can help to make the lack of structural protections less bad.
Thank you. And I'll just put a shout out for the gender affirming care clinic at the UNC SHAC. SHAC is a clinical program that's run by medical students who are supervised by fully licensed healthcare providers. And they started a gender affirming care clinic about a year ago and provides completely free services. And now doing it by telehealth, but previously doing it in Chapel Hill. So that's also available to people. Let's see. Oh, somebody else wanted us to know that Planned Parenthood South Atlantic is doing hormone therapy via telehealth for new and established patients. So I think that there's some options out there. And as a follow-on to Transforming the Carolinas, I don't even know if you know this, Ames, we have some really amazing research assistants who are putting together a directory, building on what we were told during those interviews with trans people and providers of people who provide gender affirming care in North Carolina and South Carolina. GLAMA, which is Health Professionals Advancing LGBTQ Equality, also has a link with affirming care providers, and WPATH, the World Professional Association for Trans Health, also has a list of their certified providers. Oh yeah, 2 people wanted us to know that Planned Parenthood was providing affirming care. So
also important, make sure you're advocating for Planned Parenthood. Honestly, the funding that Planned Parenthood gets, the federal government's doing everything they can to try to make Planned Parenthood go away. And they're a major provider of healthcare to trans people.
Yeah. Somebody wanted to know, can you explain why the telehealth options will end when COVID ends? Is it a legal issue, or do you think clinics will just return to business as usual after the pandemic?
It is a question of reimbursement. So healthcare, for some reason, it was like a lot of the rules about healthcare were created, before telephones existed, before the internet existed. And traditionally, the practice of medicine has placed a premium on the interaction between the provider and the patient. And reimbursement for healthcare services reflects that. So generally, well, before the pandemic, it was much more difficult to get reimbursed for seeing someone over the internet or for screening them or providing some kind of services over phone, because people thought like, oh, it's going to be too easy, like to defraud the health insurance companies, whether that's by patients or by providers. And so there were special rules that were put in place. In some cases, telehealth was an option, but it wasn't reimbursed at the same level. So, this is the way health insurance makes things unattractive to healthcare providers, is by giving them less money for things. And telehealth has been really significant in the pandemic, that not only is there reimbursement for, primary care kind of appointments, also behavioral health, therapist appointments through telehealth, but they're reimbursed at the same rate as in person. And so that has, those things have been transformative for making sure that people can still access care without having to, potentially make the risk of the pandemic worse. And again, there's not really any reason why they couldn't just continue. There's, certainly there's talk about, potentially doing more pilots more broadly across the country, even after the pandemic passes, but it's just hard for many people to see past when that might happen.
Yeah. I was thinking like post-pandemic, when is that going to be? There was a question too about what do you recommend to support trans teens or minors, especially those who don't have access to specialized healthcare like gender clinics in the areas where they live?
And really, yeah, it's young people, I think, that we should be worried about here, particularly LGBTQ young people, trans, non-binary, and gender expansive young people who might not have support at home and might have been relying upon their social networks at schools and don't have access to those networks anymore. So I think there are a lot of educators who are trying to, again, like healthcare providers, making heroic efforts to go above and beyond to provide spaces and resources for trans and gender expansive young people to get connected. It's really hard for anybody other than a parent to get healthcare to a young person, someone who's under age 18. There's complicated, and there's some kinds of healthcare you can get, like you can pretty much get an HIV test, I think, if you're age 13 and up. So there's some healthcare that parents don't have to consent to, but transition related healthcare, mostly parents have to consent to. So there are also, if your young person isn't connected, there are plenty of trustworthy networks online. Most of the LGBTQ centers have closed in a lot of states because of the pandemic, but a lot of them are providing online spaces for young people to find support and get connected to resources. I know that I was just on a webinar last night that GLSEN, which used to stand for the Gay and Lesbian Straight Education Network, but now, like GLAMA, is an acronym, just did a webinar about ways that teachers can support Black Lives Matter and can support LGBTQ young people in curriculum, which is significant because there was just a teacher in Texas who was disciplined because they had Black Lives Matter and pro LGBT. I think they had a rainbow in their office, and that was seen as indoctrination. So, you do be careful, but there are national organizations that are trying to make sure that young people get information. Also, the Trevor Project and the Trans Lifeline continue to be available for young people who are thinking about suicide, and that's important at this time, especially when many of them might be cooped up in homes. So there's work going on among shelters that work with young people as well to try to make sure that during the pandemic that people, I mean, it's hard. it's hard to make to get by if you are houseless, but it's especially difficult in a pandemic. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of national orgs, and there's a lot of grassroots organizations that are springing up to fill in that void, like mutual aid societies. Campaign for Southern Equality just announced some additional grants either yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, I saw that come out, and I know the money goes out almost as quickly as it comes in. But there are a number of organizations, and we can probably provide that afterwards too. We have a question about, are there any important research questions that you think need to be answered to address the legal issues that affect trans and non-binary people, access to healthcare, or their health in general?
So maybe it depends on whether we're talking about like research that would be like in law review articles versus the scientific evidence base. I would say across the board, there is not enough information in the scientific research database about transgender people, about anything related to transgender people's health. And we again are so fortunate to have Dr. Poteat here in North Carolina, because she's done this research for decades. And in fact, I just got a book that Dr. Poteat's name on about LGBTQ research. So I think that there are providers who want to do that research, and the NIH Sexual and Gender Minority Research Office is focused on providing more grants to investigating some of the impacts of discrimination in the trans community, but there's continues to be a need for it.
Mm-hmm. I would second that, and I didn't pay Ames to say all these things. He's just trying to embarrass me on a webinar. But I would say some of the more exciting research that I've seen happen happening is research that explicitly links the legal and policy environment in which trans and non-binary people live with health outcomes. And I think that kind of data is really helpful, so that people can see how these laws damage the health of people in communities. And I also recently saw someone who linked some financial outcomes. I forgot, it was a YouTube channel. I don't even know where I was in the YouTube rabbit hole, but somebody was presenting research on how, if this particular state stopped discriminating, how many billions of dollars they would save in healthcare costs that are now spent in trying to help address mental health crises among trans and non-binary people. So I think that kind of research, especially in a capitalist society, might have some power to move people. Let's see. So there's some really specific ones. I'm going to group one of them. So two of them. One is that there's an eating disorder therapist who wants to know if there's things that they need to be particularly aware of in providing competent treatment. And then another person who wanted to know about how to offer a sliding scale specifically to trans people without asking them to reveal information that they might not want to provide in a medical setting. So sort of lump those together, because I know we're running a little short on time. Go ahead.
I would say like this directory that that Tonia has referred to is an indication of the way that word travels within the trans community about where you can get healthcare services that you can afford from people who are not going to be hateful and like place you literally at risk of violence when you go to the doctor. So I would say for the sliding scale question, like if you put the word out that you are offering like to oversee people's hormones on a sliding scale, then trans people will come to you. The issue of what all information you ask or don't ask on your registration forms is like a bigger question for another day. But I think there are a lot of healthcare providers who are increasingly seeing that it's important to be asking what is people's sexual orientation? what was their sex assigned at birth and what is their gender identity now, because those things can help them figure out what kind of healthcare people need. So it's actually relevant and treating conditions that people might actually have. I think the eating disorders question, there's there's actually a good evidence base around LGBTQ people and eating disorders. And it is starting to develop out to include transgender people. I don't know if, I'm trying to think if I've seen good research about non-binary people related to eating disorders. But in fact, UNC has a trans health conference, and they had a breakout session last year that covered eating disorders. So there's definitely specialists around in North Carolina who can help fill you in. But anytime you have, you're working with issues around someone's body for a transgender person, that should be a question that you want to get answered, is how does a person's transness or gender identity, how does it or does it not factor into the perceptions that they have about their body that might be part of an eating disorder? But I'm not a clinician.
I think that was a good answer. There are two that I think are going to be relatively quick. One person asked about more information on HIV status, laws, and discrimination. And I think there's an opportunity to review this. I think the excellent presentation, I know everybody wasn't able to join at the beginning, and some awesome links that have been provided for folks to get more information. And then there's a person who has a question about conducting a study with trans and non-binary people and how to reach networks of trans and non-binary people. And this is my main shtick, that partnering with trans-led organizations, trans people in your community, building trusting relationships is going to really be the best way to engage in that kind of research.
Yes.
So, yeah, Ames, closing statements.
Yes, there are networks. I certainly can connect to Facebook groups that have a lot of people who check in on them, and we regularly, send around research opportunities, especially if you can pay people to participate in your research. That is ideal. What was the other? Oh, yes, the other question I want to say briefly. In addition to looking at transforming the Carolinas, there is an organization called the Center for HIV Law and Policy that has done a lot of work about HIV criminalization. They've done some work around molecular surveillance as well. They have a whole casebook around HIV criminalization laws, and they're a small policy shop, but their knowledge is deep and goes back, decades that they've been doing this work. So they're also a really good resource to get information about laws that criminalize HIV. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Ames. I really appreciate, as I said, your deep well of knowledge, your commitment and connection to community. And thanks to all the people who joined us today. It's been a real pleasure. And stay tuned for the next webinar from SHARE or from the TRANSnetwork.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Bye-bye.